She's arguably one of the women who won the Wars of the Roses, though it came at a terrible price. But Elizabeth of York is often overshadowed by her more famous family members. Now, though, it's time for her queenship to take centre stage. In this video from History Calling, I look at how the former White Princess adapted to life as the first Tudor queen. From her role as a mother, was she a pregnant bride? Stay tuned to find out my thoughts. Her duties as a consort and her relationship with her husband, Henry VII, and his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. You'll also learn about her interactions with her daughter-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, and the tragic chain of events that led to Elizabeth's demise on her 37th birthday. When we left Elizabeth last week, she was almost 20 years old and had just married King Henry VII on the 26th of January 1486. This was a marriage made in dynastic heaven. It brought together the two warring factions of the Plantagenet family, Elizabeth's York side and Henry's Lancastrian blood, and effectively ended the Wars of the Roses, a conflict which had raged for decades over who would hold the throne. It also proved highly and very quickly fruitful, for Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, a boy named Prince Arthur, barely 8 months after the wedding, on the 20th of September at Winchester, leading to speculation that she was a pregnant royal bride. Is this well-founded, though? Well, maybe. It is just about feasible that Arthur was a month premature, but equally his parents were engaged to be married by the end of 1485, after Henry defeated Elizabeth's uncle Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth and took the throne, and in the 15th century, engagement plus consummation with a papal dispensation on the way to account for the fact that the pair were distant cousins would have been enough to make the union valid. It is therefore possible that Henry and Elizabeth began sleeping together in the weeks before the official wedding, and that she was indeed expecting by the middle of January. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter though. Arthur was born after they married, and there was never any question about his paternity. He arrived not a moment too soon, for the Tudor dynasty needed him to prop it up as it faced its first serious test. In Ireland, a young boy named Lambert Simnel was being passed off as Elizabeth's cousin, Edward, Earl of Warwick, son of her paternal uncle, George, Duke of Clarence. Simnel was a puppet, of course, with his strings pulled by the adults around him, but the attempt to oust Henry picked up some high-profile supporters, including Elizabeth's paternal aunt, Margaret of Burgundy, and another York cousin, John, Earl of Lincoln, whose mother was another of the new Queen's paternal aunts. The real Earl of Warwick was alive and in custody in the Tower of London, and was quickly displayed to the city's people to prove the fallacy of the Simnel conspiracy. But still, the little boy was eventually crowned in Dublin as Edward VI in May 1487. The attempted coup only came to an end when the king defeated the conspirators at the Battle of Stoke on the 16th of June, and Lord Lincoln was killed. As for Lambert, he ended up working in the royal kitchens and later as a falconer, and lived until at least 1534. Clearly, though the Wars of the Roses were essentially over, they'd left a bitter aftertaste. We can only imagine that it was at best embarrassing and at worst infuriating for Elizabeth to have so many members of her father's family trying to undermine her husband's rule, as well as her position as queen and the rights of her newborn son to the crown. But there is speculation that the Simnel conspiracy may have hit even closer to home. In February 1487, Elizabeth's mother, the Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville, who had been a fixture of court life up until then, attending her daughter in childbirth and standing as one of Arthur's godmothers, withdrew from public life and went to live at Bermondsey Abbey. Furthermore, her dower lands were taken back by the king and given to her eldest daughter. Why, though? All sorts of explanations have been put forward, and they are neatly summarised in David Baldwin's biography of Edward IV's widow. The leading theories are, first, that Henry was punishing her for the fact that she had reached an accommodation with Richard III back in 1484 at Henry's expense. Second, that the former queen, resenting the level of power and influence Lady Margaret Beaufort now enjoyed, was somehow involved in the Simnel conspiracy. Finally, that she was ill and voluntarily retired to the Abbey. Amy Licence also suggests that she simply wanted to retire from public life after all that she had been through. Before I discuss the likelihood of each of these theories, if you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel with the notification bell switched on so that YouTube lets you know each time I upload. For more from History Calling, you can also find me on Patreon, where I share bonus material including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts and blog posts. In addition, I have an Amazon storefront where I've gathered together some recommendations for history-themed books, TV shows, movies and more. Both are linked in the description box below for you, as is my Instagram account. There are problems with each theory to explain Elizabeth Woodville's sudden departure from court life. If Henry was punishing her for giving up on him in 1484 and reaching an agreement with Richard which allowed her and her daughters to leave their sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, then why did he wait so long to have his revenge? If she was ill or wanted to retire, why give up her income and render herself little more than a pauper by royal standards, reliant on a pension from her son-in-law? If her plan was to oust Henry and see him replaced with either Simnel or the real Warwick, we have to believe either that she was willing to see her daughter and grandson's positions destroyed and their lives endangered, or that she had some other plan, possibly to have Elizabeth marry the real Warwick and rule with him. These all seem pretty far-fetched to me. A marriage to the real Warwick was not even possible anyway, because he was only 12 in 1487 and the minimum age for a boy to marry and live with his wife was 14 in this era. That plan would also still have left baby Arthur out in the cold, and it would have been a callous woman indeed who, having seen 3 of her own children disappeared or murdered and lost several others to infant mortality, condemned her grandchild to the same. I also don't see how it would have greatly improved her own or her daughter's positions. Furthermore, Elizabeth would still pop up at court from time to time for visits, and Henry debated marrying her to the Scottish king at one point, which would hardly suggest a disgrace or a lack of trust in her. In short, it's one of those little mysteries we'll probably never have a satisfactory answer to. Whatever the reason was, she went to the Abbey and pretty much stayed there for the remainder of her life. With all this going on, it is little wonder that there was no coronation for the new queen until November 1487, when she had recovered from childbirth and when the realm was peaceful enough to allow the ceremony to go ahead. When it did finally occur, it was, like all the other important events in her life, held at Westminster Abbey, where the crowds were so great they had to be held back to allow her to pass and to keep her safe. Elizabeth had been a popular princess, and now she was a popular queen. As for her relationship with her husband, the evidence is mixed, perhaps indicating that they had their ups and downs like any other family. Certainly, Elizabeth and Henry were strangers to each other until late 1485, and their marriage was not expected to be a love match, but that was par for the course in 15th century royal unions. Some 17th century writers would say that Henry was cold towards her and resented her Yorkist relations, but Expense's records show that he was never stingy with her, despite the reputation he's gained for being miserly, which I always think might have stemmed from his years in exile when he had very little to his name. His wife and children were always suitably attired, attended, housed and entertained for ones of their rank, and Elizabeth was not short of beautiful clothes, jewels and festivities. Furthermore, it appears that he never took a mistress or fathered any illegitimate children, something which was extremely unusual for the time period and which hardly suggests a miserable broken marriage that was only for show. The couple would have a large family. After Arthur came Princess Margaret, who arrived on the 28th of November 1489, followed by the future Henry VIII on the 28th of June 1491. Next came a sister named after their mother in July 1492, but who died in 1495, then Princess Mary in March 1496, and Prince Edmund in February 1499. In this case, there seems to have been a problem with the pregnancy, for the Spanish ambassador wrote that there had been much fear that the life of the Queen would be in danger, but the delivery, contrary to expectation, has been easy. Sadly, Edmund lived only 16 months, dying in June 1500. Elizabeth's last child was Princess Catherine, who was born in February 1503 and died soon after. There may also have been a boy called Edward, born in the late 1490s, but the records aren't clear about this, and it may be that he was being confused with Edmund. If we look at this painting of the royal family, painted after Elizabeth's death, which includes all the other children also already dead by that point, depicted as though they had had a chance to grow up, even if they didn't, there are only 3 princes present, suggesting that there never was an Edward. Gaps of roughly 3 and 4 years between children might suggest that the royal couple were hardly head over heels in love and unable to keep their hands off each other, but it may be partly explained by unrecorded miscarriages and by the fact that Henry VII had to spend considerable amounts of time away from Elizabeth in order to traverse his new realm, put down rebellions on occasion, and allow his new people to get to know him, while she tended to stay around London more of the time, especially when pregnant. None of the royal children lived full-time with their parents. As was the norm for the time period, they had their own establishments, with Arthur at Ludlow as Prince of Wales and the others at Eltham. They visited the King and Queen for major events such as Christmas and New Year, and were in turn sometimes visited by their parents. They were all highly educated, and David Starkey has suggested that Elizabeth herself taught Prince Henry to write based on some similarities in their handwriting. I find this less likely myself, as I don't think she would have had the time, and Henry had his own tutors, and any similarities found are, I think, attributable to them simply being taught to form their letters in the same way. See my video on old handwriting to learn more about this topic. One of the most serious threats to the throne came in the 1490s, when another pretender, called Perkin Warbeck, claimed to be Elizabeth's youngest brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. Starting in Ireland in 1491, he travelled around Europe spreading his story and gaining the support of Elizabeth's paternal aunt, Margaret of Burgundy, as well as Charles VIII of France and Maximilian, King of the Romans. King Henry responded by having his second son created Duke of York in 1494 to have an alternate holder of the title, but he was facing treachery on all fronts, and even some of his own extended family were in on the plot. His chamberlain of the household, Sir William Stanley, who was his stepfather's brother and who had helped him defeat Richard III at Bosworth, was found guilty of planning to replace the king with Warbeck and was executed in 1495. An attempted invasion of England that July failed and sent Warbeck scuttling back to Ireland, but he soon moved on to Scotland, England's traditional enemy at this stage, where King James IV supported him to the extent that he allowed Warbeck to marry Lady Catherine Gordon, one of the monarch's own kinswomen, in early 1496. The king and the pretender then crossed into England that September for what turned out to be another failed attempt to oust Henry, after which Warbeck ultimately returned to Ireland the following year. In the late spring of 1497, unrest in Cornwall threatened to reach London, and Elizabeth and her children moved to the Tower for safety, while Henry went to put down the insurrection, which he did quite easily at the Battle of Deptford Bridge in June. This proved to be another opening for Warbeck, though, who arrived back in England in September, keen to try to turn the discontent in the south into another assault on the throne. His plans failed yet again, and he was captured, though promised that he would be pardoned. Elizabeth was given custody of Lady Catherine Gordon, who entered her household and was treated kindly, eventually remarrying several more times and living until 1534. For his part, Warbeck was paraded through London, but otherwise well treated too under the circumstances. He was even with the royal family at their palace of Sheen at Christmas 1487, when it caught fire and was seriously damaged. No one was harmed, but it must have been an unsettling experience for Elizabeth. It was only when Warbeck escaped in June 1498 and was recaptured that he was placed in the stocks, then locked up in shackles in the Tower of London, where Elizabeth's cousin, Lord Warwick, was languishing too. There, the two engaged in a plot to escape and for one of them to take the throne. When they were discovered, both were executed in November 1499. It is impossible to know exactly what Elizabeth thought of all of this. Warbeck was brought to court and paraded around as a kind of warning to any who would think of challenging Henry, and presumably to let those who had known the real Prince Richard get a good look at him and see that he was not Elizabeth's brother back from the dead. This would have included the Queen herself. Her mother had died in 1492 and so was not available to offer an opinion, and her sisters were arguably too young to have a clear recollection of what the then 9-year-old Prince Richard had looked like the last time they saw him back in 1483. Historical fiction writer Philippa Gregory would have you believe that he was indeed Richard, that Elizabeth knew it, and that she basically threw him under the bus to protect her own position and that of her children, but there is no evidence of that. Still, she couldn't deny that Edward, Earl of Warwick, was her cousin and that her husband had had him killed. But then again, Warwick posed a threat to the Tudors' hold on the throne, and Henry had allowed him to live for many years until the Earl plotted against him. So perhaps those factors soothed any misgivings Elizabeth had about his execution. We'll simply never know if she tried to save him or considered him a necessary casualty to protect the Tudor dynasty to which she was now so tightly bound. If Elizabeth's attitudes towards Warbeck and Warwick are murky, her relationship with her mother-in-law is slightly clearer, though much ink has still been spilt on trying to untangle exactly what these two women thought of one another. We do have some contemporary documents which indicate that Lady Margaret Beaufort was overbearing towards her daughter-in-law, though. Despite her lower rank as a mere countess, albeit a countess who was also my lady the king's mother, Margaret sat next to Elizabeth at the latter's coronation, dressed in clothing as fine as her daughter-in-law's, and, although she did give precedence to the Queen in public, she walked close behind her. Margaret was also one of her son's main, if unofficial, advisors, and despite their long separation during his exile, the two were very close, with Margaret keeping rooms right next to his in the royal residences. This naturally impinged on Elizabeth's role and forced her to share the limelight. In 1498, the Spanish ambassador Don Pedro de Ayala would remark that the king is much influenced by his mother and his followers in affairs of personal interest and in others. The queen, as is generally the case, does not like it. Whether he meant Elizabeth did not like Margaret's influence, or that of the other advisers, or indeed both, is not clear, but in another letter he said that the queen is a very noble woman and much beloved. She is kept in subjection by the mother of the king. It would be a good thing to write often to her and show her a little love. The negative impression he gives us of Margaret's actions is seconded by the comment of royal servant John Hewick, who grumbled that he would have spoken more with Elizabeth at court had it, quote, not been for that strong whore the king's mother. Margaret was apparently tough to deal with at times, but the two women were not always at loggerheads. The king's mother worried when Elizabeth was ill, oversaw the arrangements for the queen's lyings-in, though was this kindness or Margaret being a control freak, and the two joined forces for literary patronage. There is no evidence of the kind of life-threateningly bad feelings which had existed between Elizabeth Woodville and her royal brothers-in-law, which would suggest that the king's wife and the king's mother made the best of their situation and found a way to rub along together. Furthermore, as Rosemary Horrocks has noted in her Oxford DMB entry on Elizabeth, while the Queen had to share her influence with Margaret, she was not eclipsed by her, for, quote, she was the recipient of gifts from the eminent, who presumably thought her goodwill worth having. The Spanish ambassador's comments were of particular interest to his employers, King Ferdinand of Aragon and his wife, Queen Isabella of Castile, because at the time they were arranging a marriage between their daughter, the Infanta Catalina, and Prince Arthur. Such a union would be of inestimable importance to the Tudor dynasty, for an alliance with the almighty Spain would signify Henry's acceptance as King of England and provide a valuable counterweight to the French threat, made all too clear during the previous few years by the Warbeck debacle. Elizabeth was involved in the negotiations too, writing to Spain that the Infanta should learn French and get used to drinking wine, as the water was unusable. If you're wondering, I don't know either why learning English wasn't suggested. A proxy wedding between Arthur and his bride's representative took place in May 1499 in Bewdley, and the removal of Warbeck and Warwick at the end of that year made England and Henry look a lot more secure, and smoothed the way for the ultimate arrival of the new Princess of Wales, as she was now to be called. Before that happened, though, Queen Elizabeth made her one and only trip out of England in the year 1500, when she and Henry travelled to Calais, then under English control, to meet Catalina's brother-in-law, Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. Infanta Catalina, or Catherine of Aragon as she is known to history, arrived in England in October 1501. After travelling to London, she met with Elizabeth at Baynard's Castle on the 13th of November. Frustratingly, we don't know what they talked about, but apparently the meeting included much dancing which lasted late into the night. The next day, the Spanish princess was married to Prince Arthur in a spectacular ceremony in St. Paul's Cathedral, and soon after the wedding celebrations were complete, the couple set off for Ludlow Castle in Shropshire. It must have seemed like the dawn of a new age for the family, with the first of Elizabeth's children married off and hopefully set to ensure the succession further by soon becoming a father himself. Also in train were plans to marry off Princess Margaret to James IV of Scotland, who had only recently been plotting with Warbeck, and a proxy wedding was held in January 1502. Queen Elizabeth and Lady Margaret Beaufort had banded together, though, to ensure that the girl wouldn't actually be sent north until she was slightly older, for fear that James wouldn't wait to consummate the marriage. In the end, however, she was still only 13 when she departed for Scotland the following year. It seemed like after all the dangers and uncertainty of her whole life, Elizabeth was now secure and everything was coming together for her. Instead, though she didn't know it, she was entering her swan song, for she would never see her eldest son again, and his fate would seal her own. In April 1502 came terrible news. Prince Arthur, heir to the throne and the focus of all his parents' hopes for the future, had died at the age of 15 from an unknown ailment. See my video on his death and burial for a wider discussion of his possible causes of death. The news was crushing for Elizabeth and Henry, who were at Greenwich when they heard what had happened. The king was told first by his confessor, and we have the following account of what happened next. When his grace understood that sorrowful and heavy tidings, he sent for the queen, saying that he and his queen would take the painful sorrows together. And after that she was coming, and saw the king her lord and husband in that natural and painful sorrow, as I heard say, that with full great and constant comfortable words she besought his grace that he would first after God remember the wealth of his own noble person, the comfort of his realm and of her, and how that my lady his mother had never no more children but him only, and that God by his grace had ever preserved him and brought him where that he was. Over that, how God had lent them yet a fair, goodly, and a towardly young prince, the future Henry VIII, and 2 fair princesses, Margaret and Mary. And over that, God is where he was, meaning Arthur was now in heaven, and we both young enough, meaning young enough to have more children, and that the prudence and wisdom of his grace sprung all over Christendom, so that it should please him to take this according thereunto. Then the king thanked her of her good comfort, and after that she was departed and come into her own chamber. Natural and motherly remembrance of that great loss smote her so sorrowful to the heart, that those that were about her were fain to send for the king to comfort her. And then his grace of true, gentle, and faithful love in good haste came and relieved her. This account of their joint grief surely puts to rest once and for all the theory that theirs was a cold, unfeeling marriage. When the worst happened, they leaned on each other. As per custom, neither was present at Arthur's burial in Worcester Cathedral, and soon, grief notwithstanding, their thoughts turned to the need to replace this lost heir, for the entire Tudor dynasty now hung on the life of 10-year-old Prince Henry. As Elizabeth had alluded to in her words of comfort to her husband, they were both still young enough to conceive again, she being 36 years old at the time. Within a matter of weeks, Elizabeth was pregnant once more, and during the remainder of 1502, she moved around the royal residences as normal. She also received the Princess of Wales at Westminster, once Catherine, who had fallen ill at the same time as Arthur, had recovered, and the Queen made sure to send a litter covered in black velvet to bring the girl from Shropshire. Her kindness extended further too, and she sent her daughter-in-law books in September. The Queen spent Christmas at Richmond, then, on the 26th of January 1503, she went to the Tower of London. Remember, it was then a royal residence, not a prison. The intention seems to have been that she would deliver her child back at Richmond, but it never happened. Her labour began, and it was in the Tower that Princess Catherine was born on the 2nd of February. Perhaps she was a little premature. Perhaps her mother had miscalculated her dates. At this point, it doesn't really matter. As I mentioned earlier, the baby, who was of course a girl instead of the much-desired boy, died within days. And worse still, so did her mother. On the 11th of February, her 37th birthday, Elizabeth passed away from childbirth complications at the Tower, the place where her little brothers had very possibly died too all those years before, and where so many other famous names from the Tudor era would meet tragic ends as well. Henry was grief-stricken. In less than a year, he'd lost 2 children and his wife, and one commentator wrote that he privily departed to a solitary place, and would no man should resort unto him. The king, who is famous as a penny pincher, spared no expense on his queen's funeral, which cost £2,800, and which included the elaborate procession you see here. Elizabeth was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, the same place where she had been christened, where she had fled into sanctuary twice as a child, albeit not inside the actual Abbey buildings, and where she had been married. Initially placed in a side chapel while the incredible Lady Chapel we see today was being built, once its construction was far enough along, she was moved to her current resting place, which you can see here. In due course, Henry would join her there, having never remarried, and to this day their remains still lie beneath this spectacular tomb completed after his death and surrounded by those of their descendants. The inscription for the former White Princess reads, "Here lies Queen Elizabeth, daughter of the former King Edward IV, sister of the formerly appointed King Edward V, once the wife of King Henry VII, and the renowned mother of Henry VIII. She met her day of death in the Tower of London on the 11th day of February in the year of our Lord 1502, having fulfilled the age of 37 years. The year 1502 is given because the old Julian calendar was then in use in England, which took New Year as the 25th of March. If you want to learn more about that, watch my video on the calendar change of 1752. In time, as her tomb inscription suggests, Elizabeth's second son would reign as King Henry VIII, and her granddaughter and namesake, Elizabeth I, would become one of England's most famous monarchs. However, it is through Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland, that she is the ancestor of the current royal family, via Mary Queen of Scots and James I of England, the latter of whom would ultimately be buried with Elizabeth and Henry. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about her life with all its ups and downs. Let me know in the comments if you think she and Henry VII really loved each other, and for more on the Wars of the Roses and the Tudors, try one of these options next. Whatever you select, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.